Americans fighting each other over the legacy of a civil war that tore their country apart.
This is what they represent.
And is still causing death. A woman run over in Charlottesville, Virginia this summer as opposing groups clashed over a Confederate monument.
We're seeing the rise of violence and a very ugly underbelly of American culture that no longer feels that it has to check itself.
As a child growing up, I thought that reconciliation was a legitimate thing and that we had bound up our wounds.
But a conflict that ended more than 150 years ago is arguably as divisive as ever. And it's monuments dedicated to people like Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general who led southern breakaway states into battle against their northern neighbors, that are increasingly at the heart of a debate being amplified by Donald Trump's presidency. Trump's support for keeping them put the Confederacy back on the national agenda after it resurfaced in the wake of Dylann Roof's murder of 9 African-American churchgoers 2 years ago. A photograph of him posing with the Confederate flag put pressure on state governments to stop flying it. In the aftermath of the monument protests, General Lee's in Charlottesville was covered up, while others in the US have been quietly taken down by authorities or even torn down. As the former seat of the Confederate government, Virginia's capital, Richmond, has the most prominent collection of Confederate monuments and now must decide their future.
They are often symbols that create a great deal of pain.
Christy Coleman co-chairs the commission charged with that task. She supports keeping them, but is grappling with a complex post-war legacy that must account for what individual communities want.
It is a memorial period, basically 1880s through early 20th century, when a lot of these veterans were dying off and people were building monuments to their memory. But it is equally a time when white supremacy, particularly in the South, is reasserting itself in a horrific manner, where there is domestic terrorism that is running rampant and unchecked. And they are not coincidental.
The US isn't the first country faced with this dilemma.
Inside Germany itself, the Allies seized the famous stadium of Nuremberg.
When the Allies toppled the Nazi regime at the end of the Second World War, they destroyed its most prominent symbols. But extermination camps like Auschwitz were preserved to explain the Holocaust in graphic detail. Many here in the US think Confederate memorials should also be preserved.
When I see these things, I don't see glorification, I see sadness. Look at his head bent down, his back hunched over a little bit. He still has his weapon, but he's not holding it up.
Historian Robert Lee Hodge describes himself as a liberal Confederate. He thinks monuments like this one in Nashville, Tennessee, should provide more context.
Let's add additional signage as to why, the specifics of why. And but to take the things down, that reminds me of things I read about Hitler doing, or Stalin doing, or the Taliban doing in more recent times. And I just never thought I would live in a country where monuments would be ripped down.
In Richmond, removing the monuments would require a change in local laws, though this may not end a painful debate.
We are in a perpetual state, as with any type of trauma, we're in a perpetual state of no longer the shock, but rather in the denial and the bargaining.
Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Richmond, Virginia.